Erik, Chapter 14. I leaped off my boat, snared firmly in the clutches of a dark, despairing mood. I had just come down from upstairs, where I had been observing the first rehearsals the company held for their new opera. This opera, like many others of the previous century, had a role that was male, but was intended to be sung by a flat-chested woman. Like most of the productions with these breeches rules, this opera included several scenes where the woman dressed as a man was required to disguise themselves as a woman, adding another layer of hilarity that appealed greatly to audiences. I always detested shows that relied on this flimsy device, as my cynical mind refused to suspend its disbelief. But that was not what was angering me. The cast had been revealed and the parts handed out in the rehearsal I had spied on. The managers, Andre and Firmin, had decided that Christine should be given the breeches role, a part that had no singing at all. Carlotta was given the prima donna role instead. Even after I had caused all Paris to lose its collective mind with adoration for Christine's performance. It was disgusting, I fumed, aiming a kick at the piano bench. It only went to show that politics ruled the opera company as they did everywhere else. The managers feared to get on Carlotta's bad side, as they had had example after example of the problems her spite could cause. I sat down at my desk and pulled some paper toward me. I debated whether I should sketch my trademark skull in the corner, but I remembered the uproar my earlier artistic efforts had caused. I still saw Zara sometimes poking into this or that odd corner of the opera house. He seemed impervious to my warning him away. I suspected that much of his poking around was only for show, so that Andre and Firmin could rest easy thinking that someone was working on the problem of how to evict me. I settled instead for shading in a black border around the page. I paused and admired my work. It was an effective way to mark my correspondence, and I thought I would do it for every letter I sent from now on. I knew if I was consistent about it, the black-bordered pages would make everyone who saw them shudder in fear of what I had to communicate. As I finished off the border, I composed my letter in my head. Dear Monsieur Andre and Firmin, my compliments to you on last night's production of La Traviata. The chorus has improved immensely, although the ballet dancers are still largely uncoordinated. I inquired of Madame Giry what is needed to make the ballet corps the pride of this city as it once was, and she informs me that hiring a second instructor would double the number of dancers that could be supported to pursue balletic excellence. I hope we may see this addition made over the next week or so. I know she has a list of several world-class instructors that are available for hire in the city. I have already let her know that she should prepare for you to inquire of her. I must also express some concern about the casting roster for the upcoming production. Why you would overlook the bright young talent that recently set this city by its ears in favor of a woman who, despite the heroic efforts of her maquilleuse, is rapidly aging out of her opera career is beyond me. I really must insist that you rectify this oversight before beginning rehearsals. You overlook Mademoiselle Daillet's talent at your peril. I have communicated with Monsieur Lefebvre, as your complete refusal to follow my instructions made me certain that he must have neglected to acquaint you with his memorandum book and its updated policies before he left. He informed me by return letter in no uncertain terms that you both had been told that these additions are sacrosanct and must be followed at all costs. I am at an utter loss, then, to know why you have not followed a single one of my directions since you arrived here. I have thrice arrived at my box to find it sold to other patrons. In addition, you are 2 months behind with my salary. I beg that you will not require me to demonstrate that I am in utter earnest. I do not think you will like seeing your new production labor and perhaps even falter under the shadow of a dark curse. I remain, gentlemen, your obedient servant, O.G. The closing was, of course, merely for convention's sake. I had no intention of being anyone's servant ever again, with the possible exception of Christine. I wrote my letter, sealed it in an envelope, and set off upstairs to deliver it to the manager's office. As I passed by the dancers' rehearsal hall, I heard a chorus of excited squealing. There was a horde of girls on the other side of the wall, and they were working themselves into hysterics over something. I paused as I drew near, and I heard a man's voice speaking over the crowd. "He hides himself in the cellar, mademoiselle, and for good reason. His skin is as yellow as a lemon peel, and he has no nose, and he smells of the grave. His eyes can kill you with a single glance. I tell you, Mayfie, if you ever see him, you must turn and run the other way, or he will capture you, ravish you, and then kill you." I grew more irritated with every lie that came out of his mouth. My skin, while it had developed a shocking pallor that intensified with every month I hid from the sun, certainly was not yellow, and I had at least half a nose. I bathed myself as often as anyone else did, and I'd never ravished anyone in my life. I identified the voice as belonging to Bouquet. He was capitalizing on his brief experience with me to terrify the young ballet dancers, knowing that their terror would make them seek him out for the sheer excitement of being scared. I heard Antoinette enter the room. One strike of her cane on the floor sent the ballerinas scurrying for the door. Suddenly, each of them was a model of decorum, and they moved silently out the door under Antoinette's gimlet eye. She spoke to Bouquet, who was chuckling at the effect he'd had on the flighty young girls. "You ought to take greater care, monsieur," she warned him. "The opera ghost is not like to be talked about, and horrible things happen to those who cross him." Bouquet's only response was a loud, horsey laugh. I heard Antoinette sigh. "Well, Joseph, it was nice knowing you." And her footsteps moved away, following her charges out the door. I moved on and delivered my letter. I was then at a loss of what to do with myself. I thought it useless to go to the dressing room for Christine's lesson, as I had gone for 3 days in a row and waited in vain for her to show up. She seemed to be trying to hide from me. I'd scoped out the dancers' rehearsal, trying to see if she was attempting to blend back into her anonymous dancer's role, but she had not been seen since the night she sang. Carlotta had returned to the stage, more determined than ever to wring the maximum amount of adulation from the populace, so Christine's services as an understudy were not needed. She was nowhere to be seen. She hadn't even been at the first rehearsal for the new production today, although it scarcely mattered if she was only to have a silent role. As I returned across the lake to my chambers, my mind returned to the problem of Bouquet. This was not the first time I had stumbled on him trying to exaggerate the problem my presence seemed to cause. Not for the first time, I wondered what I had done to offend him so. I may as well include here, as I will not have the opportunity later, that I did indeed find out what Bouquet's problem was. It seemed he had grown up listening to the adults in his family talk and talk about an incident in which his aunt had been raped by a man with a deformed face. The boy grew up believing that that man's deformity had been an indication of his moral character, and extended that assumption to every deformed person he met. I only learned this many years afterward. I stepped off my boat into my main chamber and looked around, barely seeing the furniture within. My mind was still occupied with Bouquet. I headed for my piano out of habit, but stopped as I realized I had nothing to write down and no urge to play. With nothing else to do, I went to my desk instead. I had borrowed an interesting little treatise from the library upstairs about how to place people and objects on the stage to achieve the most dramatic effect for an audience. I hadn't had time to dive into it yet, but it seemed I had time in abundance now. As I passed the room where I had built my maze of mirrors, however, a thump behind the wall pulled me out of my bleak mood. It sounded much too large to have been caused by the rats that I was forever trying to scare away. Cautiously, I approached the viewing window I had set into the torture chamber and pulled aside the shutter. A man, whose face I could not see, stumbled around between the mirrors, trying desperately to find his way out. Shocked, I pulled my gaze back, looking around my space to figure out how he had gotten here. I had had the boat with me, after all. Had the man swum across the lake? I had my answer, as my gaze landed on the door that concealed the escape staircase I had hacked out of the earth. It was slightly ajar. He must have found the top of the staircase and come down that way. Then he'd incautiously opened the door to the torture chamber, on the other side of which was a 5-foot drop into the vortex of mirrors. That explained the thump I'd heard. I looked back at the poor unfortunate trapped in his clutches, wondering how long it would take him to reach for the noose that hung from a tree I'd crafted of iron. The man turned his face toward me by chance, and I felt shock come over me. It was Zara. Anger and irritation fought with the tug of long friendship and debt within me as I debated whether to free him or not. I had repeatedly warned him to stop poking around looking for me, yet here he was. He'd found me and found the trap I had constructed to protect myself from his brand of persistent investigation. But this man's friendship had kept me from complete isolation during my years in Persia, and his gentle heart had twice found a way to stay my order of execution. I shook my head as I realized I had no choice but to free him. It didn't mean I couldn't give him a tongue-lashing, though. I pulled him out and delivered him to the other side of the lake, scolding him all the while about trying to find me. I repeatedly pressed him to promise that he would never come back here, but he would not. He stayed silent all through my tirade, looking up at me from under his traditional Persian cap. As he alighted on the other shore, I tried to master my irritation. My ire had been inflamed by his calm refusal to acquiesce to my wishes. He, for his part, stood on the shore, made a quick little bow in my direction, and said merely, "It is good to see you, Erik. Until we meet again, then." Then he turned and glided away up the dark corridors that led to the surface. I felt my irritation crest as I pulled the boat back to my home. I spent the next month rather detached from the events of the opera company. Upstairs, the opera company worked on its new production. Christine returned to the opera house. Rumor said she'd gone to visit her father's grave in Paros-Girek. She stood glumly where she was directed during rehearsals, having nothing to do other than to impersonate a set piece. Down below, I was busy improving the defenses of my home. I altered the way my escape staircase connected to my home. I rerouted it so that its foot lay within the mirrored torture chamber. I calculated that if I needed to use it to leave, I could enter the mirrors and find my way out, and if Zara or any other incautious soul should find the top of the staircase again, they would be dropped directly into the torture chamber at the bottom. I rigged a door at the new foot of the staircase to close and lock as soon as anyone passed through it. I procured a silver chain, threaded it through the only key, and wore it about my neck under my shirt. Opening night approached for the new production. Despite my repeated letters and warnings, Carlotta remained in the leading role. I had heard Christine rehearsing the role, prepared again to act as the understudy as I passed her dressing room. But the chances of her being allowed to step into the role seemed slim, as Carlotta remained as irritatingly healthy as always. Although I'd had no opportunity to speak to her, Christine seemed very depressed. I knew that Carlotta was going out of her way to be spiteful to her. I knew also that Christine had a sense that her opera career was over almost before it had begun. How else could she explain the fact of her being given a silent role? I watched her closely for a while before I got a sense of what else was bothering her. She was lonely and wanted a beau like all her friends had. I had told her if she accepted a suitor, I would cease to help her, and even though she wasn't speaking to me at the moment, she still seemed hesitant to forego my help. I knew she had received several letters from the man, Raoul, who had visited her after she fainted, although as far as I knew she had yet to respond to one. I wasn't sure what else I could do or say to keep them apart. Surely, one day soon, she would decide her training was finished, and I would lose all the hold I had over her. Bouquet's behavior was also unsettling me. I had delivered him several notes, expressing my wish that he remain silent about me and what he knew. These notes went unanswered, and his behavior did not change. I wondered how someone could be so oblivious to the threats I had sent them, until it struck me. Bouquet could not read. How was I then to warn him? Antoinette had warned him verbally, and he had ignored her. I put this problem to the back of my mind for a while. I had a different scheme occupying my full attention. Opening night finally came. I watched from the shadows of the flies, my box had again been sold, as the curtain rose on the stage below me. Carlotta strutted around the stage, while Christine stood silently in the background. I brought my attention back up to where I stood high above the stage. Several stagehands were clambering about up here, getting the scenery ready to be raised and lowered as the scene on the stage required. I would not be able to pull off my previous trick of dropping a canvas onto her, not without being caught by the dozens of eyes around me. That was all right, I thought. I had a different plan. I waited until Carlotta was in the middle of a technically tricky aria, then I made my move. I took a deep breath and projected my voice to bounce all around the auditorium. Did I not instruct that box 5 was to be kept empty? It was as if a witch's curse had struck everyone in the auditorium. The players on the stage stilled. The audience froze. Then, after a long moment, like the first droplet of melted wax running down a candlestick, the scene below me began to move. Patrons whispered to one another and craned their necks to figure out where the voice had come from. The players on the stage did the same. The unlucky patrons seated in my box rose and fled out the door in terror. Meg Giry gave a little scream and grabbed the hand of the unfortunate ballerina beside her in a death grip. Carlotta paused with her mouth still open, astounded that anyone would dare interrupt her. Christine paled, turning the color of new milk as she recognized my voice. She looked around wildly and said, mostly to herself, "It's the Phantom." Carlotta suddenly found something about this situation she could control, Christine. She moved close and hissed in Christine's ear, "Silence, you little toad!" I thought with satisfaction that this made it easy to pick which of several possible endings to my plan to execute. "A toad, madame? Perhaps it is you who are the toad." When I said nothing more, the assembly below me slowly shook off its dazed state and resumed where they had left off. Carlotta returned to the beginning of the aria and started it anew. I waited until she got to the trickiest part, then used my skill of ventriloquism to project a toad's croak from her throat. The audience stilled again for an instant, then a tide of hilarity started to rise. Giggles and guffaws erupted from the audience and the players alike. Carlotta tried valiantly to keep singing, but I kept overpowering her voice with my own croaking. I finally stopped, but could not resist sending my laughter out around the auditorium as she ran off stage in tears. I heard how foreboding and ominous it sounded as it bounced back to my ears, but I did not care. Andre and Firmin stood and made an announcement to the house. They informed the audience that they would require a short break in the opera to change actresses. They intended to put Christine into the lead role. The ballet came on stage to dance while Christine hurried backstage to get herself ready. Finally, I thought. I moved off, away from my place in the flies, as I realized I had accomplished all I needed to for tonight. I had humiliated Carlotta and promoted Christine to the lead. I drew back into the shadows as I realized 2 men blocked my path up ahead. They stood right by the ladder that led to the ground, so I could not do anything but wait here in the shadows until they chose to move. I drew as close as I dared. One of the men was Bouquet. He was talking to another stagehand. "I spoke to that Persian fellow that hangs around here. He says he found a back way into the ghost's lair. I want to go down there and drag him out of there with a rope around his neck, I tell you. We don't have to put up with the likes of him living with us. Will you join us after the show tonight? Practically everyone else is coming down to rid the theater of this garbage." The other man stammered a non-committal reply and moved off. I shook my head in resignation. This had to end, now. I spotted a coil of rope hung neatly on a post, ready to be used for whatever task the stagehands needed it for. I took it up and sidled toward Bouquet. He was occupied with watching the whirling ballerinas on the stage below. I quickly knotted my rope into a lasso and sent it sailing through the air to land around his neck. He felt it land on his shoulders and grabbed for it to remove it, but I had already pulled it tight around his neck. I moved in close to him to get more leverage on the rope. He began to choke as the rope cut off his air. I moved around in front of him to watch his face. I didn't bother with any fancy speeches or reproaches as he died. He knew why I was there. He slumped suddenly, falling halfway over the railing of the catwalk we stood on. I tied my end of the rope securely to the railing and pushed his body the rest of the way over, to hang swaying over the whirling ballerinas. The house erupted in screams and shouts of shock as they understood what they were seeing. Below, in the wings, I saw Christine costumed and ready to go on in the lead role. She was staring up at me. She'd seen me push Bouquet over the rail. She put her hand to her mouth as if she had sudden nausea, then turned and fled. I saw a man pursue her, a man dressed as an opera patron instead of as a participant in the show. Though I could not see his face, I knew it had to be Raoul.